Started here. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ian Campbell. I'm Vice President of Operations at PASIC. I am the staff lead for the Risk Officers Program, and I'm your host for this afternoon's webinar. Welcome. This is our first Emerging Risks webinar of the year of 2025. We had over 180 registrants from 70 companies right across the country, and a special welcome to first-timers. I want to thank my colleague, Danica Hall, who's working behind the scenes to keep everything on the rails and make everything flow efficiently here. You're in for an entertaining 90 minutes of discussion. We hope you find it informative. And before we do that, let's look at the agenda. I'm going to just quickly go over some housekeeping items. I will introduce our industry panel of CROs, and we're going to close the broadcast talking about our next event, which is March 31st, a Risk Officers Forum meeting, and a satisfaction survey that we always conclude with. So in terms of housekeeping items, you're very familiar with the MS Teams platform. This is an interactive broadcast. We want your questions in real time. We ask you to use the chat function or the Q&A or put your hand up. You see that in the taskbar across the top. We want to make this interactive. So if you have questions or comments in real time, we'll ask you to use one of those functions and provide the question. We'll be looking to see if your hand is raised or if there are questions in the Q&A or the chat. Antitrust compliance is in effect throughout the broadcast. You are competitors. You will remain competitors throughout the broadcast. The Competition Act is in full effect. And again, I talked about a satisfaction survey that we're going to close the broadcast with. So in terms of our industry panel of CROs, I'm going to ask them to activate their cameras. Our first is Loreley Chekay, Executive Vice President, General Counsel, and Chief Risk Officer for Saskatchewan Government Insurance. And Michel Fournier, Vice President and Chief Risk Officer for Beneva. And Phil Traicus, Vice President and Chief Risk Officer for Wawanesa. So welcome, everybody. And in terms of questions, we have a number of questions to prompt the panel. Just to give you an idea, this is really a facilitated discussion. Our panelists don't profess to have all the answers to all these questions, so they're going to give their best take at this. And if you have additional information that you can share, we certainly invite that in real time. And we have a number of questions grouped in a number of categories. So we'll talk about tools for risk identification and sourcing information. We'll look at processes, strategies, and approaches to risk management, specific risks, and observations from our panelists. So let's throw it to the panel now. Maybe you could, just in the first few minutes here, give us background on what you do in your organization, how long you've been there, that sort of thing. And let's throw it to Loreley. You've got a very interesting organization you work for. We were talking just before we came to broadcast here. Loreley said, I've got to give some perspective to people on this because you're maybe a bit of a unicorn compared to others in the industry. So let's go over to you, Loreley.
Thanks so much, Ian. Hi, my name's Loreley Chekay. I've been with SGI now for 6 years. I actually come from a fairly different background. I was a Crown prosecutor prior to that for 15 and in private practice. So my perspective is a little bit different. My expertise is from the legal perspective, but I do have the Chief Risk Officer role. What I mentioned to Ian was we are probably the unicorn in the group here when I looked at the participants. You'll obviously, from our name, we're Saskatchewan Government Insurance, so we are a government Crown entity. Our shareholder is the Government of Saskatchewan, and we have a parent entity called Crown Investment Corporation. And what's unique about us, many of you may know that we are the mandatory public auto insurer in Saskatchewan, but then we're also Saskatchewan Government Insurance Canada, or as you might know, SGI Canada. And that's where we're a P&C competitive insurer in the 5 Western province, well, Ontario West. But then we're also the regulator for driver licensing, permits, plates. And then we also have the responsibility on behalf of the government for traffic safety. So we own the traffic safety legislation in the province, and we fund traffic safety. And so I say that just to give you some context that my answers may be very different to many of you or your experiences when you're in a private company or a private entity, no matter the size. Like we're probably on the smaller of the insurance side when we look at the Canadian market. Obviously, we're the dominant insurer within the province of Saskatchewan. But I give you just a little bit of that background just to give you some perspective that my answers may be very different to my colleague panelists for that perspective.
That's great. Thank you. Michel?
Yeah, I can go next. Well, hello everyone, and thank you, Ian and Pasek, for having us. My name is Michel Fournier. I'm the Chief Risk Officer for Beneva. Beneva itself, I think, is also kind of an interesting amongst insurers because we have the P&C side, we also have group benefits, and we have life and annuities. So we have all three lines of businesses throughout the company. I'm the Chief Risk Officer for the group for all three lines of business. I've been with Beneva for 3 years now. And for those that are not familiar with Beneva, we are a relatively young company. It was announced almost 5 years ago today. So it was La Capitale and SSQ that merged. Both were mutuals. And now Beneva is the largest mutual insurance company in Canada.
Great. And Phil?
Hi, everyone. Excited to be back on the panel. I think it's been a few years now that I've been participating in this forum. Phil Traicus, I'm the CRO at Wawanesa Mutual. Similar to Beneva, we are a mutual company. It's in the name. We focus on P&C business, both personal and commercial. We also have a life business. I've been with the organization for 4 years now, and we offer products all across Canada. My background's actuarial. Prior to joining Wawanesa, I worked at an insurance consulting firm doing a lot of traditional actuarial work from pricing to reserving to capital modeling. So, I've been in the risk space for quite a while now, different angles, and these days focusing really on the key risks faced by our organization.
Great. Thank you. So this is, I think, our 7th year of doing this topic at this time of the year. It's our first Risk Officers Forum event of the year. And a number of years ago, Susan Meltzer from Aviva at the time said she was the chair of our Risk Management Advisory Committee, and said, we'd love to do, just to kind of prime everybody, what are all the emerging risks out there? Let's have a discussion of that as we enter the new year. That's our very first event of the year. And let's try to identify the kind of the black swan issues that people may not be aware of or that are festering out there and people should be paying attention to. So we've, over the years, kind of by committee, developed a definition of what is an emerging risk. And so just to kind of do a level set, it's always new and different for every panel we put together. So heading into this broadcast, the definition that we had for this event, emerging risk is an accelerating risk where the outcome and or implications are not known or clearly assessed, and or where there is not appropriate ownership or classification of the risk. And so I'm going to throw it to the panel to kick off. Do you agree with that? Is that a good working definition of an emerging risk? How does that jive with how you look at risks for your organization? So let's maybe throw it to Michel to start off.
Yep. Yeah. Well, first off, something in risk as a whole, I've worked in risk in a few companies as well. Everyone does it differently. Emerging risk is itself a definition that every company has a different one. Like even culture risk is another example that everyone has a different definition for. For us, we split it in 3 parts. So there are risks that are known, that are managed regularly, say insurance risk, market risk, and that we'll have in our risk dashboards and whatnot. Then there are risks that are on the horizon that we're worried about, that we know about, but kind of worry us. And there are some that are more out there, more longer term. But I'd include more difficult to quantify easily would be what I would put in the bucket of emerging risk. But it all, essentially awareness, talking about it, sharing is the key part. So it's I wouldn't get too stuck on the exact definition, to be honest.
Okay. Others?
Yeah, I would agree. Sorry, Ian. I would agree with that. I think we have to be mindful that definitions sometimes contain us and don't let us think outside of the box. So I think it's important to have a definition, but be dynamic and flexible in your thinking and your gathering of information and your discussion at that table of what works for us, what doesn't work for us, and what's going on in the industry.
Yeah, I'll echo all those comments. You know, we get challenged sometimes when we go through our process of identifying top and emerging risks. Should we differentiate between top risks? Should we differentiate between emerging risks? We have a similar view where we'll look at short-term and long-term risk, kind of bucketing those in, let's call it the 1 to 3 year horizon and 3+. I think that is relevant for these discussions, but again, don't want to get boxed in based on how we've defined things. We want to keep this broad. And, you know, a lot of times the discussion isn't just on the risks. The more you go up, it's around how are you managing these risks. And that's where we want to spend most of our time.
We do a biannual ERM survey, as you know, people out there are very familiar with this. We're going to be doing this, launching it in June. It's going to be assembled. The survey results, the summary results will be assembled over the summer. And at our September meeting, we're going to present those to the industry. And one of the last two questions we ask, what are the risks that we need to worry about in the first 1 to 3 years, which is exactly what Phil was talking about there. And then we look at risks more longer term, the 3 to 10 years. So that'll be interesting. It changes all the time. And for example, I think 2 years ago, we had human resources as a key concern for people, just losing and trying to attract and retain talent, which wasn't ever on the horizon as a risk people had on their minds, but that jumped in and led us to the next year having a panel session on human resources. Okay, so let's get into the questions that I have to prompt the panel. The first one is again in the category tools for risk identification. So what risk identification tools are most popular in your organization? What do you use? And let's throw it to the panel. Phil, let's start.
Sure.
With you.
You know, I tend to bucket these into two, internal and external tools. So you touched on a valuable tool that we actually use is the PASIC, what is it? The PASIC survey as a starting point, right? But there's a lot of other external benchmarking tools out there that we leverage, and for the most part, there's a level of consistency. I do like the Canadian perspective that PASIC brings, but I think it's important to have that global mindset as well, because sometimes they manifest in other countries before they hit the Canadian book. From external, there's also consultants that you can leverage, and just keeping your nose to the ground and just keeping your eye on what's happening in the news. You know, no doubt tariffs is going to get discussed a fair bit during this conversation, but you know, we just need to be mindful of that. And we also leverage internal tools to help identify risks. So we have things like surveys, we have discussions and consultations with the business, top up, bottom down. So those are just a few examples of things that we leverage.
Great. And Loreley?
Yeah, I've obviously, I think we probably all leverage similar buckets when you think about the areas. But from our perspective, one thing we keep a close eye on is what's happening obviously within Saskatchewan. What are some really key points, because that can influence our strategy and our risks from having a shareholder as government, right? Like everything that Phil said is everything that we have. We have internal surveys and questionnaires and tools. We have the external, we have the consultants. One thing that is interesting is we keep a close eye on media and change in insurance and what's happening in insurance and what the media, but not just on the insurance perspective, but little things that might actually appear political, that when you dig a little bit deeper actually have a influence on how you might develop some of your strategy, and then actually through that discussion expose where you might have to have some risk identification. I'll throw an example at you that some of you might be aware. So we have, because we're government, we have someone who watches the media daily. And so we get summaries of things that they highlight. And one thing that came to our attention recently is the class action in relation to Michel and Autotex against Canadian insurers, right? There's 13 Canadian insurers. We're lucky right now we haven't been named, knock on wood, but some of you who are participating have been named. And things like that, unless you're named, you sometimes aren't aware of. But you know what? It's actually a significant class action for the auto insurance, like the auto insurance piece, to be aware of. And as a risk officer, how does that impact your organization? You're so far removed right now, it's not a litigation pertaining to you. But as it moves along, even if you're not brought into it, it may actually change how you do your products. It may actually change how you do some of your processes. And that's a risk, because that impacts your organization, that impacts your strategic discussions, and that impacts your risk identification. So that was just something I wanted to add on to Phil, that it's a lot closer, but I think we all probably use very similar tools, because it's not like there's any sort of unique hyper secret tool out there that isn't really being sold, because then nobody would make the money to market those tools. I'll throw it over to you, Michel.
Yeah, I completely agree with Loreley and Phil that, yeah, it would be beautiful if there was a one-stop shop that we had all, here's your top 10 risks for the year. And like something that we have our emerging risks from an industry perspective, but then the ones that pertain specifically to Beneva that we're concerned about. And to fill that, one thing that we do well throughout the year, we do RCSAs. I'm not sure if so risk folks are familiar with that, but risk control self-assessments that we'll do with the different business lines. We'll keep notes on the side. So that's a very much like a bottom-up exercise throughout the year. It should not be about emerging risk. It should be about active ongoing risk, but sometimes throughout that exercise, we'll get ideas and notes that will help us with our emerging risk exercise for the board and the different ideas. So that tool, the RCSAs, can sometimes on the side also help give other ideas. But as Phil and Loreley mentioned, there's multiple publications that we'll also use and references.
And I think, sorry, go ahead, Ian.
Sorry. No, please, after you.
I was going to say, I think the other thing that sometimes is perhaps undervalued is our people, right? When we think about tools, we think about perhaps surveys or systems or processes. But I think people is a huge aspect of having a risk identification tool or process. And I say that because at SGI, we were so small for so little and we grew very quickly, but our risk department or our risk resources didn't grow. And so it's only recently that there's been a shift to say, okay, you know what, we can only do so much when you don't have the capacity and the resources. You can have these tools, you can have these systems, but you actually need people to educate your organization, whether it's your front line, whether it's your second line. Like, you need people who have the expertise, the skill, and to then really get that information flowing both up and down so that the organization has a really robust risk program.
In our ERM survey, we have a question about the flow of information in an organization, and this is something that's changing over time. I've seen in the last 2 rounds of the survey, where we ask about the sharing of information in the organization, and there always has been very strong rapport with or very strong feedback saying that they share information with management and the board of directors. And now you're seeing more organizations are keying into frontline staff, sharing information, and then with outside stakeholders. So that's evolving over time, and it was just a very tight circle of information. But like you're saying, Loreley, that it's opening up, and these are kind of like untapped sources. If you're not talking to frontline staff about what they're seeing and hearing, then it's a kind of a lost opportunity. And that was a question I had here. So how and from whom do you get risk information in your organization? So again, just tapping down to the frontline staff. Is there one source within the organization you're always talking to? Do you interact often with your board of directors about risk management? How often are you engaging with the board in your organization? Because that's one of our ERM questions.
Yeah,
Michel?
Yeah, I can take a stab at that. And well, for me, it was yesterday. So, but no, we have a risk committee of the board. So our board risk committee meets quarterly. We talk about specific risk issues at the board. From an emerging risk perspective, I've heard some companies do it more frequently than we do it annually. Some companies do it quarterly. We do it annually right now at the board level. I don't think emerging risk, there can be more on the horizon that occur. For example, I'm sure some of you risk folks have seen that there's a meteor that has a 2-3% chance of hitting Earth in 5 to 10 years. But the generally, we keep that survey. We do that annually. To go back to your question, Ian, on sources and internally, we do an online survey that we ask our board, but also internal folks to rank. We give them different scenarios, and then we ask them to rank them 1 through 5. You know, 1 being the biggest concern, and 5 being the least. Obviously, they need to make choices amongst the different risk. They also can add some that weren't listed, but then, you know, given how the survey works, it's difficult to have it included within the top 5. Will be that survey is done like both on a 0 to 2 or 0 to 3 years and 3 to 10. And that's like what's interesting from the results is then to compare, you know, the results from different groups, because everyone looks at risk from their own vantage point. So it's interesting to see like the different perspectives on risk and what worries people. Generally, the folks at the board will be more strategic and will be more longer term by nature than the folks internally that will be looking at risk more from a day-to-day perspective.
Yeah, I'd say we follow a very similar process to what Michael described, with maybe a few different nuances. We're on an annual cycle as well. We do report to the board quarterly on the top and emerging. Typically, we wouldn't put too much effort in re-ranking these. They're meant to be short to long term. You don't expect too much fluctuation, although every now and then something dramatic will happen. We'll have a new president come in and kind of throw everything up in the air. What we do focus on the quarterly basis is more on the mitigation side. So what are we doing internally to mitigate against some of these risks? So that's where we'd focus our effort. And then on the annual refresh exercise, we will we'll do a full kind of deep dive. So we used to do a member survey or a survey across the various functions. We moved to a more informal consultation, which is, I'd say, a bit of a heavier lift, but it just allows for more free form. It does become a little bit more challenging to compare kind of year over year, so you do have to be somewhat focused in these discussions. But it's just been we found it a good use of time and an opportunity to kind of do multiple things, including kind of embedding risk culture. And then we take all this information, we have these similar conversations with the executive team, and then finally with individual members of the board, and aggregate this information together to come up with kind of our final view of the top and emerging risk process.
So with the requests that we have at the end of the ERM survey, where we talk about risks in the first 1 to 3 years and then 3 to 10 years, we've been very careful not to kind of put ideas in people's heads, that we just leave it wide open. Just tell us what's on your mind, and we get the responses that way, rather than actually prompting them, and then it just becomes easy. I just says, I'll dump my answers over here, I'll pick these 3 and we're done. It's been more organic, and I think it's we do see there's 1 or 2 you kind of think, where did that come from? We had it made the list in the past, and it became a subject for discussion, is PFAS this year, that we dove into that, because that was identified a little while ago with our last survey as an issue that people need to be mindful of. Danica, if you could help me, there's a question in the chat. Can you share the passing definition of emerging risks? So in that document, the Word document, Danica, hopefully you can grab that and cut and copy that into the chat there, and then people will have a kind of a working definition, or I'll include it as well in the follow-up note that goes to all members, that this was in the broadcast. This was the working definition heading into this discussion this afternoon. There we are. Perfect. Thank you so much, Danica. That's great. Okay. A question in the question and answer from Peter De Silva. Thank you, Peter. What emerging risks 1 to 3 years out are currently keeping you up at night? So let's maybe go around the horn. If you could give us a couple, what are the issues top of mind? Just totally catch you flat-footed. What's on your mind? What's got you worried? Loreley?
I would jump out at AI is a risk that I see from a number of factors. AI is part of our world. It's going to be part of our world going forward. Depending on where you are in the organization, depending where are you in your personal life with understanding it, knowing it, understanding technology. The biggest concern for me is trying to put enough guardrails in from a corporate perspective that the accountability still remains with the individual decision maker rather than wholly allowing a decision to be made by AI. And I say that wanting to adopt AI, wanting to use AI for efficiencies and processes and those sort of things. But there are times I believe that sometimes we're jumping so quickly into AI that as individual decision makers or corporate decision makers, we're sort of handing off that accountability to the technology and we don't know always enough about the technology and its biases and things like that. So it's putting up those guardrails to, yes, let's adopt the technology, let's use it, let's find efficiencies, let's incorporate it, but let's also make sure we are alive to the biases, because that exposes us to greater risks of when you're an insurance company and people are coming to you at the worst time of their lives and when they're making a claim and things like that, that if you are inherently not looking into your AI and how you're utilizing it in your decision-making processes, that exposes you to greater risks, future state, more on. So that's one of the pieces, but I'm going to stop now and let the others speak.
Yep. Well, once again, fully agree with Loreley. I guess that's an awkward thing about risk folks. Generally, we all agree with each other, or maybe that's a Canadian thing. One that right now, which is more maybe a convoluted answer, but the interconnectivity of the different risks. So, and an example I would give of that is geopolitical risk plus cyber risk. So those two combined in the current environment, with Russia and all the different attacks and cyber risk, we're having this conversation via Teams right now. You just think 5 years ago how these different conference calls, IT is everywhere. It's used at every single stop. Even you look at the CrowdStrike event last summer, that was not an IT outage. That was just, an IT failure. But the combination of the geopolitical risks combined with cyber risk is something that I would say in the current geopolitical environment personally worries me a bit more.
Yeah, I think I was going to focus in on political risk, but Michael, you touched on that. So, it's both local and geopolitical. We see what's happening in certain regions across the country that's making it challenging for a lot of carriers. And, we ask ourselves, is this something that's going to promulgate across other provinces? Is the scope of political risks, which flows into regulatory risk, going to expand potentially into other products? And the thing that we've been battling and thinking a lot about is, how do you immunize yourself against this? What are some of the mitigating strategies you can put in place? Diversification is a big one, but it does become challenging. And then when you overlay that with geopolitical risk, it exasperates the issue. So that's one of many probably risks that certainly keeps me up at night.
You know what, Phil, I find that really, you hit the nail on the head, and it's interesting because when you're actually a government entity, you have a very close relationship with government to a certain extent, where you sort of share some of the risks, some of the future sort of what's the word I'm looking for? Sorry, I just out of mind, but forecasts and things like that. But on the other hand, you don't have that relationship, and you want to stay at arm's length because you are a competitive business. You are trying to make decisions that are what's best for the entity, not just what's best for government. And then in many of your worlds where you are a private enterprise, there is always that concern of government overreach as well, right? And so I think an example of where we as insurers can potentially have an opportunity for what's our best interest and what's at the government best interest is in climate resiliency, right? When you think about climate resiliency, you think of this past year, we had the biggest Canadian CAT situation with those four major events between Toronto, Montreal floods, the Calgary hailstorm, and then the Jasper fires. Some of those, perhaps, had we 20 years ago had relationships with government, both at the federal level and the provincial level, municipal level, and the insurance industry, of when we rebuild better. There's incentives and things like that, like working collaboratively. We all sort of succeed, both from a public policy perspective, but also from a financial perspective. So I think there's an area where the times may be changing for private business, maybe, just maybe, getting a little bit more involved in the dialogue with government when it serves all of our needs. So I wanted to comment on that.
Yeah,
Great.
good point on the resiliency. Maybe just to go back to the geopolitical and the environment right now with climate risk and everything. I've used this metaphor internally. I don't know if some of you have watched ever, those domino competitions on YouTube that you see the first domino fall and all of a sudden there's a balloon going up, there's something else happening, but you don't know from the start, that first domino fell, what's going to happen. And I kind of feel that that's the environment that we keep adding oil, climate risk, geopolitical risk, cyber risk, all these things all together. But what's going to be the outcome of all this? Uncertainty is definitely up in the current world affairs.
We're going to reach into the Q&A. Katie Lee and Christine Malagek have asked questions, so I'll ask them in the order received. And this is good that these are questions on people's minds, so we want to answer that. So how should we assess U.S. tariff and retaliatory tariff risk for the next 4 years? Which line will get a higher impact for a Canadian insurer? Let's throw that to the panel. Let's maybe start with Phil and then go around the horn with Loreley and Michel.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that the board probed us with last quarter, and we've been doing some scenario modeling on the impact of such a tariff. And there's so much uncertainty on when, if, to what extent these tariffs may play out. So we had to try different scenarios. We're predominantly a personal lines carrier. Like I said, we have commercial coverage as well. So there's lots of different angles that we looked at. So claims inflation is obviously going to be one of the critical areas that's going to get hit. Taking a look at the products you offered, getting an understanding of what's labor versus parts, for example, breaking out the components into their subparts and understanding, all right, what comes from the states, for example, and not focusing too much at the moment on mitigating strategies. That was kind of okay, so what after this exercise, but really just looking at what's the worst case, assuming no management actions. And then on the commercial space, what is the ripple that this is going to have on the Canadian industry, and how is that going to affect people's insurance buying preferences? Are some of these industries still going to be there, and to what extent are they going to be there in the future? And then, I mean, I think we're already seeing this today is the volatility in the investment market. So applying shocks, and this is fairly judgmental, right? Is it already baked in? I don't think it's baked in yet, but we are seeing some volatility today. I think it's going to be, it can be worse depending on the extent of what these tariffs look like. And then, I'm sure many of you have seen some of the news reports on the fact that if these tariffs are implemented, we probably won't see kind of that rebound effect that we did with COVID, for example, and how the general economy rebounded afterwards. It may be a slow recovery. So I do think that this hit will be could be pretty significant in the short term and could take a bit of time to recover afterwards.
Please.
Yeah, I'm going to go a little bit more on a rather than a blue sky high level, a little bit more detailed, because our board had that same question. And so obviously much of the focus from our board is often Saskatchewan orientated. And because we're a government entity, we actually have quite close relationships, for example, with the auto body shops and those sort of things when we're talking auto. So those discussions are front and center, like you say, because of claims costs and all of those sort of things. One of the other pieces of the unicorn to our organization is we actually run a salvage operations thing. So when there's a total loss vehicle, we actually recycle parts and salvage. So one of the discussions is, do we start now looking at the greater used parts industry within Canada? That sort of hits the double whammy of, providing, keeping money and resources within Canada, but also maybe igniting that industry and then reducing the claims cost. So that's just sort of an example of one of the things that got heightened very quickly by our board to say, are there any mechanisms within the province that we can do for this particular area of the organization? Obviously, that doesn't help us anywhere else in the other parts of the organization. But I do think we do have to get very creative and have full awareness because it is the unknown. As we've known in the last month, the tariffs were happening one week, then next week, then this week, then 40%, then 25%, then 10%. And it's a complete unknown. But it has to be modeled and it has to be talked about and has to be considered so we're ready, so that we're not coming from behind to try to address these risks, or at least make our board aware and our shareholder aware.
Fully
Okay.
agree with Loreley and Phil. We also looked at it per line of business and different types of impacts that could flow through. Maybe just to add one more idea out there from a scenario that's more concerning would be like a stagflation type of environment where, like, given everything that with retaliatory tariffs and a lower dollar, that you'd have like a higher inflation environment, but within a recession, so that type of scenario is more of a concern, but from a sustainability, solvency perspective, those are not from that regard that we're concerned about it. It's just, from a growth and from a general economy perspective that we're looking into these things.
Got a question from Rachel Holm. I'm going to come back to that. So Loreley, I'm going to put you on deck here for the next question. Loreley mentioned working with government, and can you provide an example of that? So we're going to come back to that in a minute. But let's go to Christine's question. When would you transition a risk from emerging to active or evolving? We kind of use the 1 to 3 years as, that's an emerging risk in the 1 to 3 years. And then it kind of becomes, we can deal with it. We know about it. Is everyone on the panel kind of comfortable that you classify the life cycle of an emerging risk would be in the period 1 to 3 years? Is that kind of a good catchment area? What are your thoughts?
I can take a stab at it, but from our side, I would say goes back to our initial conversation. We're not too rigid on that. I'd say cyber risk, we do consider it as an ongoing risk, but we also include it within our emerging risks. There's some that are in both, in part because of the evolving nature of the risk. It is, you could say it's the time horizon, but there's also some, let's say, earthquake risk. We actually put it in emerging risk because it's not something that ongoing, but there is earthquake risk. So it is something that we track and we remind folks. So I wouldn't be able to, like, I wouldn't say earthquake is necessarily 10 years out, but it's more of a probability perspective.
So Loreley, let's come back to that other question. Loreley mentioned working with government. Can you provide an example? What comes to mind for me is imposing mitigation strategies into regional building codes. For example, requiring homes in certain areas to be built with hail-resistant roofing. Is that what you're getting at? And if so, how open is the government generally to that kind of feedback?
Yeah, that is what I'm getting at. So from what I understand, the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction, I had to think about ICLR. I understand has been working with the federal government to try to get some funding. I don't know where they're at or anything like that. And I think specifically one of those things was in relation to flooding. But when you look back, Calgary, I believe, and I don't know if it was all insurers in Calgary, but there was some pilot projects happening in Calgary for a period of time in relation to exactly that, like hail resistant roofing. And people could get, I believe it was the city of Calgary may have done it, even at the municipality, it might have been Alberta government, I'm not quite sure. But they gave incentives to people that, you know what, if you've had hail damage and you're rebuilding, we will give you a rebate of X amount of dollars if you choose to go to that higher level. And they actually, from what I understand, ran out of quota or ran out of money because people were willing to do that. One, not just cost efficiencies and effectiveness, but it meant people weren't out of their homes or didn't have to lose their belongings or things like that when they could see the value of that. So when I'm talking about working with government, I think that there has to be an awareness of what is the federal government looking to do? What are the provincial governments looking to do? What are the municipal governments looking to do? And sometimes they're not all necessarily speaking with each other. Sometimes they need the data from the insurance companies, which is what ICLR collects, right? Is that data to give them to show that this is what's best for not only the people of Canada, but the economy as well. And also it's a fiscal sort of responsibility for all parties. Insurance companies don't have to pay out as much. Federal government doesn't have to kick in into emergency funds when there's a catastrophic event, things like that. So when I talk about working with government, it's building those relationships and encouraging them to, if you're willing to share data with them, and obviously we're not talking about sharing economical or fiscal like sensitive data, but data where that they can help municipalities and influence building codes and things like that. So we have probably an advantage as a government crown to have those conversations with our province. And we're more than happy to sort of share our experiences. I know our CEO, Penny McCune, has been working with ICLR to sort of say, this is what we do in the province where we can share information but we're uniquely positioned because we're government owned, right? So it's very different from the private industry, but ICLR, I think, has been making a lot of inroads with building that relationship with the federal government. And then going back to geopolitical and going back over the last 4 years, we've also had some tensions provincially to federal relationships as well. So those need to stabilize somewhat as well, because I think it's all about rowing in the same boat forward to getting the best, what's best for insurance companies, best for what's customers, and best what's for the country and even the environment, right? It all flows together. Going back to what you said, Michel, that sort of domino effect. One decision can actually influence so many, and it's not diverse in interest, right? It's actually aligned to interests, both on a fiscal aspect and a public policy aspect. I hope that answers your question, Michel.
Great. Okay, let's questions come in. Lorenzo Di Iorio about PFAS. PFAS has been in the media lately. How are you all addressing this risk? We had, if you'll recall, a couple of speakers that have been dealing with this in the States. It was our risk officers forum, it was our emerging risk webinar last fall. I think people will find it on our website. You can go back and revisit that after the broadcast. But is PFAS a significant issue for your organization? Let's maybe start with Michel, go to Phil, and then Loreley.
Yeah, sorry, maybe I'm confused with the English, but I'm not. I'm confused about PFAS. So
it is the I guess the tiny particles, the plastic
particles
that have a shelf life of forever. and
Oh,
apparently
okay,
are
okay.
in 97% of everyone's bodies out there, something like that.
Oh, okay, okay. Yeah, to be honest, it's not something that we've delved
Okay.
into at this time.
Yep. And Phil, how about yourself?
I mean, I'd echo that. I mean, we have been leveraging information from some of our reinsurers to, you know, just bring our knowledge kind of up to par in this space here. But I wouldn't say that it's a burning platform. There's other things that we're focusing our efforts on at the moment.
And Loreley?
I would ditto. It's an area of information awareness that you have to have your finger on the pulse. But with everything else that's happening in the world, unfortunately, it's not at the top of the priority chain.
And I think what brought it to the state's attention is applications for class action suits against insurers. And so that's kind of, it's interesting for us. It's out there, certainly is, meets the emerging risk definition. Something to watch for. And we had a lot of people tune in to find out, like, what's that all about? So, okay, one other question, then I'll get back onto my Adam Beltramini. What are your biggest fears related to the ongoing trade war with the US? And do you think the US will try to annex certain provinces like BC, Alberta, or Saskatchewan for the resources? Also, I noticed there's a PASIC autonomous cars and lithium batteries webinar coming up this year in October. What are some of the emerging risks associated with this technology? And should that be on our radar? So kind of two questions about the trade war. And we're going to be reaching out to the Institute for Highway Safety, Mark Moore, very animated speaker. And I think he spoke here probably last 5-6 years ago, something like that, on autonomous vehicles. So we're bringing him back, and we're going to ask him to talk about lithium batteries and autonomous cars, update us in that whole area. And he's got lots to present on. So a very interesting speaker, and kind of hold that thought for the fall. But what are your thoughts on the trade war? And is a real concern, and then just about the autonomous vehicles. Let's maybe start with Michel, go to Loreley, and then Phil.
Yeah. Well, maybe to go back to emerging risks and the definition, there's always, a probability of, say, an alien invasion or something like that, but we have to disregard those and focus on, to go back, there's always the top 10 and key priorities. What's awkward about the current situation with the US, these are things that we would have excluded straight out in the past, and not, war, given our geographical location. Of course, we've got Russia, our northern neighbor, but US to the south, so that was fine. So it is an awkward one. I don't think it should be disregarded, such as the alien invasion. I do think that the probability is extremely low, but it's always the challenge of where do you draw the line as to what you include and exclude. The current tone and whatnot makes it difficult to know what's serious or is just exaggerations and whatnot. So yeah, not an easy topic to have, a black and white view. I think it goes back to the domino analogy that it's difficult to know from the first piece falling where all this will play out.
And Loreley?
I would
trade war
I would
concern?
I would
Yep.
agree with you. It's just something to sort of like listen and keep on the radar and an awareness. But from my perspective, where sort of maybe this rhetoric is more about leveraging for potential negotiations, right? The reality, I appreciate there have been many countries over the years that have been invaded and taken over and things like that. But it's not a simple transition of just saying, hey, I want this piece of land and I'm going to take what I want. So yes, the rhetoric is there. I think what we'll see is a lot of sort of trade negotiations happening related to tariffs that try to influence resources. But I think it's the reality. My perspective is this is a long, I think we might see autonomous vehicles like in Saskatchewan. And I say that because Saskatchewan will be the least of the areas that has significant infrastructure or satisfactory infrastructure for autonomous vehicles before I see the US actually taking pieces of land. That's my personal view. So it's, like I say, it's, you read it, you have awareness about it, but there's a lot more pressing issues that are greater risks to our organizations that need to be planned, mitigated, and reviewed regularly.
Phil, you see brinksmanship, you see this as just, again, a lot of hot air to make little incremental improvements in trade negotiations, an updated Canada-US trade agreement. Is that kind of what we're seeing? I think a lot of people have that outlook that just relax. I know it's out there. I wouldn't be a good CRO if I'm not worrying about it, but really in the grand scheme of things, is that what do
Yeah,
you
you
think?
basically summarized it, Ian. Like if I had to model out all the different permutations on what could happen, I need to double or triple the size of my team to do that work. You know, as both Michel and Loreley noted, we'd be doing a disservice if we didn't take some of these seriously. We just need to and you know what? I think the outcome of these exercises are valuable in themselves. It's forcing us to answer some hard questions that I think that we've largely taken for granted. Our reliance on US for parts, and you know, I some of the things that Loreley was noting on so was it subrogation and salvage? You know, these are things that we need to take seriously. The cost of repairs is just skyrocketing, and you know, if we take the time to think about, you know, how can we immunize ourselves a little bit from this perspective, maybe we can use this more broadly to help maintain claim inflation at what it is and not continue at this accelerated rate that's making insurance, frankly, almost unaffordable. So, yeah, trying to pull out the good in the bad right now.
Okay. Lithman Adio has provided a question here. Is the increasing rate of mergers and corporate consolidation something to worry about? There seems to be strategies in prepping for something big. Thoughts on this, Michel?
Well, we recently announced our intention to merge with Gore recently but not we're still competitors at this stage. Not sure for something big. I think the industry is currently relatively fragmented, and it's you know, if we compare ourselves to the banks, it's a whole other ball game. So I think on the banking side, it's a lot more consolidated. I'd probably go back to reference the cyber risk comment I made earlier, that a lot of the things we want to do require investments. And sometimes for the smaller players, making those investments is much more challenging. And so to be able to keep up with the risks, with the environments, with the regulatory changes, sometimes it's just a requirement to be able to compete going forward.
Thank you. So Loreley, corporate consolidation in our industry, is that an issue for SGI? What are your thoughts? Is it something you really worry about?
From the SGI perspective, it's more probably when you're talking about consolidations, it's not so much on the insurance side, but for us, it's the brokerage side, because we're broker only, and that's how we sell our products. So we do monitor that because, of course, we are not a national insurer. And for some entities, being a national insurer is important, whether they want to be part of that relationship, right? So from a consolidation perspective, that's what we monitor closely and watch for, are the brokerages, not so much the insurers.
Bill, do you want to take a stab at that, or is that an issue for Wawanesa, the corporate consolidation in our industry?
I mean, I think most companies are keeping a keen eye on this. We're broker only, so we're in a similar space as what Loreley described. So we look at the brokerage space, but you know, like any good insurer, we need to keep our eye to the ground. Culture is a really important thing. Alignment of products and service offerings are important things. So these are all things that we're considering. I'm sure all the other carriers are considering when they're thinking about consolidation. Another angle, I guess, and I'm not sure it's really consolidation, is kind of that vertical integration that we're seeing a little bit more with things like body shops and just kind of expanding out of the kind of the norm of these M&A activities into something that you can leverage to help, well, from one perspective, bring costs down and maintain costs.
Great. Let's go back to the well. Another question that we had. At your organization, how does strategic planning and risk management work together on the identification of emerging risks, and how effectively are these functions collaborating to support strategic directions in your organization? So strat planning and risk management, are they working together in your organization? How would you look at that? Loreley? Is that strat planning and risk management, are they complementary? Are they kind of competing? What's your quick take on that?
I would say they're generically complementary. What's really, so going back to sort of that risk identification, whether it's your top 5 or top 10 or whatever you identify within your organization, that generally influences your strategic planning, right? And we've modeled over the years how those prioritized risks. Obviously, having a government shareholder, that's always an area that has to be mindful in our strategic planning, is not just what's about a business, but also what's part of this government strategy, right? We have to be mindful of that. And that's also part of the risk. So from my perspective, they cannot work siloed and independently. They have to be integrated because one influences the other, right? If you have major risk exposure and you go off siloed on a strategy, you're never going to be able to implement your strategy to full efficiency and effectiveness without having awareness of the risk and the mitigations. And that comes into when you get into the deep details, budget and resource allocation, all those sort of things. They have to work together. So in our world, having awareness of what our sort of top risks are and what our sort of top exposures are influences your strategy. Now, sometimes the strategy has to pivot because we have different influences or different guides that we're provided. But at the end of the day, when you look at it from a wholesome perspective, they have to be very integrated and collaborative.
I saw you nodding there, Phil. You're in total agreement with that? Is that?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I've got a
Okay.
framework. Maybe I'll share with how I think about the integration. I do think it's critical that they're integrated. I think about it from like both an offensive and defensive approach. So kind of the offensive approach, it's really assessing the risk of the strategy. So looking at the strategy and identifying the risk. And I think you need to look at both the downside and upside of the strategy. So the downside is really what are the risks associated with this? And the upside is, well, what happens if we don't do this? Are we at a competitive disadvantage? So I think it's important to take those two angles. And on the defensive side, it's really around starting with the risk and building strategy around that. I think that there's going to be these emerging risks or top risks that we need to kind of deal with head on. We can't just ignore them and build our strategy around them. Sometimes you actually need to build your strategy to directly take on these risks. So that's, really high level of framework that we like to use here to think about how we integrate and we challenge and work with strategy.
Kel, I sense the same. You're just muted right now, I think.
Yeah, maybe to share a personal anecdote, risk and strategy are both sides of the same coin on some level. And about 25 years ago, my first job in risk, my boss was responsible for strategy and risk, which from a 3 lines of defense perspective is really bad. But nonetheless, it's someone, if you think about those 2 roles, we're both people that look out in the future, think, all different outcomes with the path and all that. So there are many, I would say I'd go back to Loreley, complementary aspects. And in regards to what Phil was saying, how we go about it to rank our top risks that which are not necessarily emerging, more let's say 1 to 3 years out. is we will share our strategic plan and say, what key concerns do you have relative to that strategic plan? And then we'll identify top 10 key risks that could jeopardize, or different events that could put in jeopardy our strategic plan.
Okay. Another question I'm going to pose to the panel. Do you see value in surveying internal employees and or external partners as part of your emerging risk identification process? And if you do, what tool do you use to conduct the survey? How frequently do you do that survey? So what I'll throw it to the panel and whoever wants to offer advice here. If you're going to be doing a survey, do you do the survey, and what tools do you use? How frequently? Sure, Michel.
I can take a stab at that. Well, first off, yes, we do use a survey. A metaphor I've used in the past, it's if you like marbles in a jar, if you ask like a class, each kid will get the wrong number of marbles in a jar, but on average, the whole class will have about the right number of marbles in the jar. So surveys will be like, we're a small team, the risk team. We don't have ears and eyes everywhere. So the larger the survey, the most beneficial it is. And I alluded to the survey that we do internally before, but it's really about getting to listen to the organization and get the most input possible. And then we can share back the results of that survey with the folks that gave it to us. And it's interesting, to see their reactions, to see how other people scored it. We do not, we keep it anonymous. We do not share the who said what, because I think sometimes people are, it's almost as if it was a test and not a survey. So I do believe that for something like this, it's really useful that the survey be anonymous, but we do like to know which business line or which level in the company the person is from. But those surveys are extremely useful for emerging risk and also getting the pulse of the organization. In regards to your question about the frequency, for now, we do it annually.
Okay. Good. Loreley, Phil, is that surveys, are they used? What tools you're using to do that? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, like I said before, we don't have a formal survey. We used to have one. We leverage kind of these consultations that we do with the business. As noted, it's a little bit heavier lifting, but it's an open forum, so it's not kind of boxing anybody into identifying a specific risk, but really giving them the freedom to express what exactly is facing them. So it is a little bit more challenging to aggregate it all up, but certainly a very useful tool for us in the risk function to understand what risk they're facing.
Yeah, I would agree that surveying and speaking with your internal is extremely valuable. Like, we currently actually use an HR survey in some cases. We also have a quarterly risk assessment we do with our risk owners, and we're also in the process of developing a parent process rate questionnaire for each of our departments to then build into part of their engagement with the risk department, and then aggregate the risk up to a strategic level. But I think, again, going back to one of my original comments, your internal employees are the ones that sometimes see things that you may not see, right? And they may not realize that they see it. So to me, part of having this engagement is building out that risk mindset throughout your whole organization. People sometimes, from my perspective, people sometimes see risk as a little bit of a dirty word, and they don't always appreciate their role in identifying risks or even mitigating risks. And so I think part of that engagement and getting that feedback and perspective really then starts to allow us to encourage and incorporate their risk knowledge and their risk mindset into the whole organization.
And this whole session is about first identifying risks and assessing them. A question here: do you have any tips for implementing an emerging risk identification process? So there must be some people out there that are feeling a little exposed. I don't have an official process in place. It's kind of organic how we do it here. Is if you it's kind of like drinking from the garden hose. How do you get this in place? How do you get it up and running? What, if you had like key tips to somebody out there that feels a little, just, they don't quite have a firm process in place. What are some guidelines? What are some key points that they should know about what you do to see what's coming down the pike? And I'll throw it open to the panel if anybody wants to
I
jump
can
in.
take
Sure.
a stab at it. Like something that I've made the mistake too many times, so hopefully you can learn from my mistake is like work backwards, because generally, you know, you have a deadline that you want to present to the board and whatnot. Let's say it's in Q2 and all that, but working backwards and then do times two relative to that, because it's really we do a lot of interviews, surveying, talking with people, note taking, calibration, you know, for the message, because ultimately what you communicate as your key concerns and emerging risks also communicates your understanding of your own risks. So you want to make sure that that's calibrated correctly. So like working backwards from, you know, when you want to present, and make sure you have a lot of buffer time, make sure that you talk to the, you know, the right folks in the organization, not only senior management, but also the lower levels to get all the proper info. But, you know, there's a lot of like to help them have the view from the industry. Like we were saying earlier that, you know, the eyes on the ground and all that is very useful, but sometimes they don't necessarily have the time to look at all the industry publications. So to summarize that to in layman's form, and to give them like the big idea, what within that concerns you or other aspects. So we do have a lot and many conversations. When we have these types of interviews and discussions, we try also to not, that it's not always the same person within the risk team, because that also, you know, everyone hears differently, so we try to match it up differently as well.
Great.
Maybe I can share a couple tidbits, and kind of in the same vein of working backwards, think about what the outcome of this exercise really is all about. And I see it as a mitigation strategy. That's what we should be focusing on ultimately. If you go to senior management or the board with a list of your top risks and that's it, I don't think you're going to get a warm reception. They'll ask the obvious question of, so what? What are you doing about these risks? This is great. I'm happy that you've gone through this exercise, but what is the ultimate outcome of this? So thinking about where you want to end up, I think that's an important starting point. And I think you also need to take a look in the mirror and just understand where you are in that maturity scale from a risk perspective. Like, how bought in is your organization with risk management in general? So I think you can calibrate the type of program that you build out based on that maturity scale and kind of where you want to go. So just a couple thoughts.
I think that's a really great comment, Phil. And I think, like, I can speak from experience, is exactly that's what we did a few years ago, is let's take a look where we're at. And let's get someone external, take a look where we're at, and provide us some guidance on right sizing for our organization, because we're a little bit different, and what's industry standard, and where should we aim for, because nobody can go from to go to gold standard immediately, right? So let's work through that. But I think if you are struggling and not really sure what next steps are, and you have the ability to get an outside consultant, I would highly recommend it, because it's a fresh set of eyes, a different set of eyes, and they have that industry lens on different organizations, different sizes, different perspectives, and where people have different priorities, right? And that can give you some guidance to maybe what's most important to you. And sometimes what's most important to you as the risk officer isn't always what's most important to the organization or to your board. And so that's another area you have to gauge. Because in order to move the needle forward, you do need buy-in from your executive and your board. And there's ways to do that, and finding some resources and direction can be really beneficial.
To join on top of that, Steve Lukacs asked a question here, just trading on what you just said, Loreley. Who are good consultants to help with that? Where would It's kind of a dangerous question, right? I don't want
That is
you
a
seem to be
dangerous
endorsing.
question. Well,
You,
all the big consultancy groups do them,
that's a
right?
good
Like
safe.
in
Okay.
my world, we have less, but you've got your PwC, your Deloitte, your Accenture, your MNP. I suspect if you're in a larger center, there might be more. But your big firms all do risk consulting. And then you've got your resources through Gartner as well as a big, and I think I can't, you literally can like Google risk specialists, and they all have capacity to do these type of things. You may want to talk to someone in your organization. You may already actually have agreements with some of these consultants in other areas of your organization that you don't appreciate that you do. Like in SGI, we have agreements with multiple consultants for their research databases, for their consultancy work and things like that, that you as a risk department may not know about. So you may be able to piggyback onto some of those resources. So I would also encourage you to speak to some of your colleagues to, hey, what consultants do you use, or what things do you use? But yeah, it is a little bit of a loaded question because I'm not suggesting any of them are better than the other, but there are lots of
You don't
opportunities,
endorse.
options out there.
Absolutely. Okay. Adam Beltramini came in with another question. What was the name of the auto class action that you had mentioned, Loreley, at the top of the session? So if you could give us that.
I will get that and I will put that in the chat.
Perfect. And for open to the panel, is there a risk of greenwashing? What do you think of the, sorry, just on a different note, what do you think of the risk of greenwashing is as an emerging risk and or accelerating risk? Is that something greenwashing that's of concern to you, your organization?
We've listed it like as part of more, not amongst our top risk and concerns, but it is something that we have shared to raise awareness on some level for ESG type issues, that especially with what we see right now, that you do too much, you have issues, you don't do enough, you have issues. So it's but we're a mutual, and for us that's part of our DNA, so it's less of our concern. But I imagine for public companies to finding the right tone can be more difficult.
We were talking earlier about processes, strategies, and approaches, and I want to respect people's time here. We have just over about 15 minutes left on the broadcast. So how do you collect feedback from your board? How in sync is your board with management? How often do you liaise? Do you report quarterly, semi-annually, annually? How often is dialogue with your board in terms of direction, feedback from them? I'll throw it open to the panel. Who wants to run with that one?
I can give it a kick. So we meet with the board quarterly. So it's kind of a quarterly board cycle, and we have a risk committee of the board meeting tomorrow, actually. We do, we report on the key risks faced by the organization, the emerging risks, what we're doing to mitigate against these risks, management action plans, if there's risk breaches. And these are all valuable conversations. I think one of the more in-depth ones, and I did touch on this a bit earlier, is the individual meetings we have with the directors of the board annually. And Michel alluded to this as well. Their perspective is different than the business perspective. They have this top of the house perspective. They've got a more global point of view. And I think it helps kind of consolidate some of the things that we're thinking about and hearing. And another piece that was brought up earlier was the interconnectivity of the risk. I think that they're particularly keen on how risks are interconnected. A lot of individual business units are thinking about what they're faced with on a day-to-day basis, but when you aggregate those all up together and you see how, there's a rope attached to all of them, and as you pull one, the other one moves as well. I think that's an important job that we have as risk leaders in the organization.
Maybe to touch upon that, and maybe to reference also a publication that I like. It's not entirely on the insurance side, but the World Economic Forum has a nice risk report that comes out annually, and they show the interconnectivity of the different risks. And we had done that internally for ourselves, like similar charts. They seem easy, but they're not that easy sometimes because you can have like big lines and straight lines, and ultimately you're trying to show like a nice, succinct image that summarizes the key risks. But that aspect was particularly appreciated from our board for them to see, not each risk in isolation, but to see the bigger picture. To go back to the original question in regards to how often we meet with our board, as I mentioned, we have a board risk committee. Actually, it's our board risk ethics and IT committee. So I'm not sure of that acronym, but it's all three together. And we meet on a quarterly basis, and we also sometimes meet individually with some of the board members if they have specific questions, because during the board meetings, it's so many topics to cover in such a short amount of time. So if there's any deep dives that are needed, we'll have separate sessions with some of the individual board members.
Yeah, and we meet, we have a risk committee of the board, and we meet with the board 5 times a year. And we try to engage with them. Specifically, we have a risk session twice a year with them. But recently we actually changed our terms of reference for all committees, including the board, to make sure that there is a risk consideration in all deliberations of the committees. And so that's part of their terms of reference. So putting sort of like the accountability on the board members as well to raise any questions and concerns and anything they may have awareness about, or to challenge management to say, have you considered these type of things? So, yeah.
Revisiting a point from earlier, we're talking about other resources. You can tap some of the big firms out there. Don't forget about the big broker services is in the chat from Christine Melgek. They have great advisory services and tools as well. Also in the chat, you're gonna find Loreley has posted information about that class action lawsuit, and leave that to you folks out there to cut and copy that and look at that later on. Going back to processes, strategies, and approaches, how does responsibility for identification of emerging risks get split out in your organization between the business or the first line and risk management the second line? How is that? Is there a top line drawn that you can? How do you divide that out between first and second line of business?
Well, I can take a first stab at this from, well, if you think ERM, the E in ERM, enterprise. So the risk is there to provide the enterprise view of risk. So we will be, the second line risk will be leading the exercise. However, for us, there's so many experts on the first line, so we don't pretend to have all the answers. We don't pretend to know what risk is should be number 1 or number 2. So we rely heavily on the first line, to source us. And as we all alluded to earlier, there's a lot of listening involved and chatting with the folks on the ground to really know what are the key concerns for them. However, for, say industry papers and all that, we'll be doing the summary of everything that's out there to make it easier for them to have the overall view.
I think you read my notes, Michel.
Mine too.
Okay, another question I'll throw out.
That's why I wanted to go
You're
first.
all pros on this. Sorry?
Oh, I was joking that I said that's why I wanted to go first.
That's good. You're all pros on this. So despite having guidance in place to help assess and quantify risk, impact, and likelihood, significant judgment is often still required. And that comes through years of experience. What advice or changes in process would you recommend to help make this easier for stakeholders and risk owners? Separately, what advice would you give a risk team as they challenge such assessments as they're made? So is there kind of advice you can give that came from experience in terms of quantifying and assessing risks?
I'm happy to give this a go. I think first off, I think it's important to have a common definition of risk assessment across the organization. I think it's all too common for one area to assess a risk is red and another to assess it as yellow or even green. So having that common view of risk assessment, you can have it across multiple criteria like financial, regulatory, reputational. But I think it's important to have this common definition. Once you've come up with this common definition, sometimes there's an ordering on who will make that first cut of assessing the risk. Is it the business? Is it risk? Whoever does, I think it's an important starting point, and then from there you can overlay that with respective judgment. And then finally, and I think I've touched on this a few times, we got to circle back to why we're doing this in the first place. We can really fine tune our impact assessment, but ultimately we're looking for appropriately sized buckets so we can make informed decisions on how to handle these risks. Having like a defined criteria on how to assess how these assessments flow, I guess, into action should be where most of the effort is concentrated.
Okay.
I think to build on that, Phil, too, is when you're starting to sort of have this sort of framework in place in these assessments, and that is coming at it with that questioning mindset. Going back to what Michel said, is like generally we're not the experts, right? And so that questioning mindset, being constructive, but allowing you to challenge some of the assumptions and things like that as well, like you said, to really pull out that detailed discussion and fostering open dialogue and really developing that structured review process. I know one thing that has changed recently for us is we have focused primarily historically on ERM. And now we have some new people in the organization who bring vast experience and expertise that we didn't have in the organization before. So now we're looking at, okay, let's build out ORM and then potentially integrate our ERM into our ORM to get even more risk identification and assessments and things like that. So that's a huge change and a huge shift for our organization. And it's going to take time because for so long that risk identification sat with risk at an ERM level. And now we're sort of really trying to push it out into the organization greater to have a lot more in-depth. And then you get into the taxonomies and all of those sort of things as well. But yeah.
Okay. A question, what advice would you give risk managers in identifying the root causes of a risk rather than confusing them with the symptoms of a risk? And again, going back on your experience, can you think of a situation where the root cause versus the symptom affected your organization?
I can share an example that I'm sure many of you will relate to, that sometimes asking someone, oh, what are the key risks? And someone will say reputational risk. And reputational risk is, for anyone that works in risk, is a consequence. It's not a cause. And it's generally, like, there are two aspects on how to go to the next level for this, to first asking the question, what do you think could impact our reputation, to get the person to think it through. But then also, while we're having these interviews, we're not trying to be smart Alex and, oh, it's a consequence, not a cause. We mostly want to get people talking and get them to share from insights. And ultimately is when we present things, we have a nice visual that we show, well, here are different things that could occur. Here are all the different causes and here are all the impacts. And in the middle, we show like the risks. So let's say, cyber risk. Well, part of the causes could be all the geopolitical environment, our own infrastructure and whatnot. But if we had a cyber breach, well, there could be a reputational impact. So the visual helps. But whilst we're having discussions with the folks, we generally try to get them to share their insights, and we don't necessarily correct them on, it's not a good way to make friends, let's say. But at the end, when we are sharing our documents, that's where we try to clarify causes and consequences.
So that builds out into that culture piece, right? Is really embedding that risk mindset and that risk culture, so people are open to that dialogue and that you're not that group that are being difficult or asking the tough questions, but we're all sort of having that conversation. Because I think for some organizations, that is a significant shift, is really having a culture of open dialogue and really collaborative in talking through some of those things, because I can come in it with my perceived notion of what the risk is or what the mitigations are or what the cause or the root is, but I could be completely off base until I have that dialogue.
The question for you, I know we're inside the last 5 minutes here. What risks do you foresee in continuing down the path of the current auto insurance product or products in Canada? Who wants to take a stab at that?
I can list a couple things that we're thinking about. Rising costs, affordability. These are clear issues. We're seeing increased claim cost, fraud, inflation. It's making premiums, frankly, unaffordable in some areas. We got tariffs on top of that, so it becomes challenging. Someone touched on the autonomous vehicles, EVs. That there's higher repair costs associated with these. The liability model is a little bit uncertain still at the moment. I'd say there's some trends around car ownerships in major urban centers. So, potentially moving away and having ride sharing becoming something that's a little bit more pronounced. Maybe the last, I've got a few things on my mind here, but the last thing maybe I'd touch on is cyber risks. So now we have these connected vehicles. Is there potential vulnerabilities to hacking, and where does the liability sit there? So I think it's there's a lot of different ways that this could go in the future.
Okay. So maybe this will be the final question of our broadcast, and let's throw it around the horn here. Once emerging risks have been identified, what do you do with them? What's your strategy for advancing them for further research, product opportunities, et cetera, within your organization?
I can take a stab at that. Sure. Maybe, well, to go back to what Phil had said earlier, like the so what, is a big impact for us. Actually, sometimes I'll call it my Halloween presentation, because it's here's everything that could go wrong. But nonetheless, we do use our presentation to, like, it feeds into priorities of the company. So like every year, we'll have some key priorities from the company. We'll make sure that if something was identified as a key concern, that it aligns with the key priorities we'll be doing. Concerns and priorities should gel together. It'll also feed the audit team. So the audit team, when they decide what are they going to do a deep dive on, it'll also feed ourselves, obviously, from a risk perspective. So it is an exercise. And well, maybe one of my favorite parts, actually, sorry, I forgot one. We were talking about culture before. And one of the aspects that I prefer about this exercise, it gives me like a golden ticket to go visit many management teams, different teams throughout the company, like to share with them, oh, remember you shared that with us? Well, here's what we did with it. Here's like the overall key concerns from. So I find like it's almost the journey is the destination in some sense from this emerging risk exercise.
And I think to build on that, it's really important that however you keep your emerging risk, that you're continually going back to it. Because when you think about it, 5, 6, 7 years ago, the regulation of autonomous vehicles, which isn't always that important to other insurance companies, but for us it is, you must get there. Well, we're 6, 7 years down the road now, and we're nowhere near having to need it. And so then you need to continually reprioritize, because there's different things happening. So now we got tariffs, now we got this, that. And so that's why that continued dialogue and reassessment prioritization is key. But it's a lot of work, right? Because you need to research, you need to have documentation, you need to understand why this is an emerging risk for your organization and maybe the industry. So there has to be some structure to it as well.
Okay, that is probably a great area or a great time to end the broadcast and thank our panel. Really appreciate your feedback here. Loreley, Chekay from SGI Canada, Michel Fournier from Beneva, and Phil Traicus from Wawanesa. Thank you very much for your input here. It really was a conversation, and we tapped a lot of thinking of our attendees out there. If you have questions for our panelists, I will put their email addresses, if that's okay, in the follow-up note, and encourage you to continue dialogue. If you have questions or comments on the broadcast that you want to take up with them, sidebar, certainly encourage that. It's information for the industry and super helpful. So thanks again, panelists. Well, let's close the broadcast with the next Risk Officers Forum meeting is going to be on March 31st, 1 to 4 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Jackie Friedland is going to be here from OSFI to talk about OSFI's update on current industry issues. We're going to move to a facilitated discussion between Alistair Campbell, our CEO, and Phil Donaldson, the VP of Public Affairs for the Insurance Bureau of Canada. And then we're going to close with a CRO panel talking about increasing regulatory demands. So no doubt the IBC conversation is going to touch on what they're doing about regulation and the concerns that they've heard from members. And then our CRO panel, again, is going to do the same thing. It's not going to be so much of a complaints-driven session as more what are steps we can be taking to move forward. I'm going to be back to everybody out there, all of our members, the people sitting in on this broadcast. We welcome your feedback in a satisfaction survey that will come tomorrow. That enhances the quality of future broadcasts, and it gives us ideas, future speakers and subject matter throughout the year. So we certainly thank you for that in advance. Thanks for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you online at our forum meeting on March 31st. That will be sent out. Invitations will go out for that tomorrow. And thanks for being part of the broadcast. And bye for now. Take care.